Hi, I'm Tracy Daly. Only seems fitting that I take a positive case from the police on this one, so let's get into it. This is from cheshire.police.uk website. Warrington man gets 20 years for murdering his wife. Straight off, this had me in both a good and a bad way, because my father got 4 years for manslaughter. Yeah, I know myself, he wanted her dead for years. On the plus side, and you'll understand why later in the story, this guy definitely deserves the 20 years. I'm going to read straight from the website. David Pomphret, 51, from Macefield Drive in Winwick, had pleaded guilty to manslaughter during a hearing earlier in the year, having been charged with the murder of Marie Pomphret. He denied the charge of murder. Police and CPS refused to accept the plea, and the case went to trial. Pomphret first appeared at Liverpool Crown Court on the 30th of September for a trial which lasted just 2 weeks. He was found guilty of the murder of his 49-year-old wife, Marie Pomphret, and on Tuesday the 15th of October was sentenced. The court heard that on Friday, 2nd of November 2018, he killed his wife via a ferocious, sustained attack at the stables the family owned at Old Alder Lane in Burton Wood. He then went to great lengths to cover his tracks, discarding the crowbar in the pond nearby, disposing of his blood-stained clothing and footwear, swapping his and his wife's cars around, and texting her phone a number of times, showing apparent concern as to where she was. After coming up with a story for his whereabouts that evening, he called police to the stables. Inside, officers found the body of Anne-Marie. An investigation into the violent death was launched. Pomphret was arrested shortly in the early hours of 3rd of November 2018, and in a series of interviews with detectives from the force's major investigation team, he maintained his innocence. Due to the manner in which Anne-Marie was found, and the extensive injuries she sustained, there had to be no doubt who the perpetrator was in order to rule out a stranger attack. In a bid to ensure that no stone was left unturned to find Anne-Marie's killer, detectives and officers from across the force joined the investigation and worked many hours alongside other specialists from across the country. CCTV in a 2-kilometre radius was checked frame by frame. More than 300 addresses were visited by officers, carrying out house-to-house inquiries. 1,300 people and 480 vehicles were logged and checked, whilst every crime scene officer and manager were tasked with managing a number of scenes and carrying out painstaking forensic examinations. Search officers were enlisted to search the home and nearby land along with the stables for more than a month. The regional underwater search team spent 24 days searching watercourses whilst 200 tons of slurry was removed from a pond at the stables and searched for evidence. A crowbar was recovered from the pond, which police say was the weapon Pomphret used to attack his wife with. 200 tons! You've got to ask the question, why on earth would the police put so much effort into this case? Unless the person was famous, important, or they had other charges. There's no way they would generally make this much of an effort, in my opinion. However, Detective Inspector Adam Waller, who was in charge of the investigation, said, "I welcome the sentence given to Pomphret. His lies and deceit caused anguish for Anne-Marie's family and prompted one of the biggest investigations the constabulary has seen in recent years. The injuries sustained by Anne-Marie were horrific, and all those involved in this investigation were determined to find her killer and ensure they were brought to justice for their actions. The diligence and determination of every single officer and member of staff who worked on this case paid off, and evidence they tirelessly gathered was so overwhelming that when Pomphret was presented with this after he was charged, he couldn't maintain the lie any longer. He was left with no choice but to plead guilty to killing his wife. However, this was after 15 police interviews had taken place, and having spent 5 months on bail maintaining his innocence." So, he'd already been out on bail for 5 months. Wow. What Pomphret did that day ripped a family apart, and he will now have to face the consequences of that behind bars. My thoughts go out to Anne-Marie's family, who have had to wait until this trial took place, and then have the upsetting details laid bare in the media coverage. I hope that whilst it won't bring Anne-Marie back, seeing justice being done will help them in some way. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who spent many hours, weeks, months of their time helping to get the truth, not only for Anne-Marie's family, but all those who knew and loved her, and for the residents of Winwick, Burton Wood and the wider community. These are notes from the court case as taken by the Warrington Guardian from Liverpool Crown Court. We are not robots, and we ask that David Pomphret is judged by who he is and someone who simply lost control in the face of what have been long-standing abuse and insults. For those reasons, we unashamedly say it's a case for you to bring to bear. Do not leave your human compassion behind. It's a very sad case. One of the tragedies in this case, above all over the years, the defendant David Pomphret was a model of self-control, patience and restraint. He had extraordinary powers of self-restraint. Without wishing to speak ill of the dead, the deceased was at times a highly volatile character, sometimes prone to violent rages out of the most trivial of details. For years the defendant coped with that. Sometimes it can build up and build up. The loss of control doesn't have to be sudden. He was a quiet and calm individual who, in the face of abusive anger and sometimes violence, developed a coping strategy not to react. After a day spent at work and shopping, things changed forever. The defendant's case is that after that trip to Asda, he wanted to go to the stables. He was doing some DIY. He needed to go to the stables to collect some items to do that work. His wife appeared to misunderstand and appeared to think he would be doing the work that night when she thought they would have a quiet meal together. She ranted and raved, saying he was useless and he had the wrong tools. She turned her attention to her daughter. Her mother would indeed insult her at times, using the most horrible language. Her father, on the other hand, was a model of restraint. She described him as her rock. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened, we say, is a quiet man finally snapped. He had the crowbar in his hand and he repeatedly struck her on the head with it. It was plainly a lethal weapon. This was a man who had completely lost his normal character and self-control. Almost as quickly as he lost his self-control, he regained it and set about trying to put together a story that a complete stranger was an assailant. The police didn't believe him. No shit. There is no evidence of premeditation. It was a sudden loss of control, not a loss of temper. He is not to be convicted of murder if he did what he did as a result of a loss of self-control. When you consider the defendant might have lost his self-control, what we invite you to consider is this. First of all, the sheer normality of the day leading up to the time when he must have killed his wife. The second thing is, because she must have died not long after they left Asda in Goulburn, the sheer severity of the attack. Does that smack of a controlled person, or might it indicate someone who is frenzied and has lost complete control? The third thing is to have regard to the defendant's character. What prompted that attack from a person of impeccable character? Mr. Pratt will now address the jury on behalf of the defendant. Yeah, by name and by nature. He says, as you have heard, the accounts given by the defendant were not true. He will need to put the record straight, and only he can do that. We will be calling him to give evidence and tell you what happened on the fatal night and why it happened. I do not take this opportunity to recite what he will say to you, but to set out the nature of his defence. Marie Pomphret has been diagnosed with a number of mental health issues over the years, including being on the autistic spectrum. She had been receiving treatment in Clatterbridge Cancer Centre for cancer. As a family, her husband and her daughter had lived with these issues for a long time. The behaviour of Anne-Marie had been witnessed by others, as indeed had the way in which the defendants had dealt with those issues. In November 2nd, 2018, the thing that changed was the defendant killed his wife. He only admitted manslaughter when all the evidence had been obtained. It was clear that he had no choice. He elected to tell lie after lie in the hope that the police would not be able to piece together the evidence to show his guilt. He decided for whatever reason that he was going to kill his wife. The severity of the force shows he intended to kill. The opportunity presented itself. Megan was staying away for the night as the daughter, and this defendant did all he could to pretend it wasn't him. The defendant was rearrested on April 2nd, 2019. Despite blood spots being found on the defendant's socks, he still maintained in the interviews that followed the arrest he had nothing to do with the death of his wife. Mrs. Pomphret died as a direct result of a violent assault, where she sustained severe head injuries caused by multiple blows to her head, mainly to the back of her head. The severity of the attack caused brain injuries, damage to her skull, and significant blood loss. It was difficult for the doctors to indicate the number of individual blows that were struck to Mrs. Pomphret's head, but there was in excess of 30 blows to her head. How mashed must that fucking skull have been for you not to be able to tell how many times it was hit? Think of it like that. If somebody who works in this field of seeing these things every other week cannot turn around and say how many times they were hit, he's hit her a lot with a crowbar. They are heavy. You don't do this shit by accident. It is her view that pattern and distribution of injuries are typical of being caused by an implement like a crowbar and would be consistent with being caused by the crowbar found at the scene. A crowbar was in fact recovered from the nearby pond. Mrs. Pomphret also sustained multiple defence-type injuries to both arms and hands, again consistent with infliction by a crowbar-like implement. The thing that bothered me a lot for a number of years about my mother's case, until I came to terms with it and logic set in, was that she had no marks to her hands. I'd seen my mother fight only once, but I'd seen her fight, and she was vicious, If you come at me with a knife, I'm going to do everything within my power to defend myself. If my arms get cut, they get cut. I know the risks that are against me here. I could die. So trust me, I'm going to do everything within my power to survive. There's a good chance I'm going to get cut in the process of it. There's a good chance the other person might as well. But I'm going to do what I can to defend myself. My mother had no marks on her arms. No marks on anything. No blood under her fingernails. No nothing that looked like she was trying to defend herself. She didn't scratch him or anything. And that played with me for a long time until I realised they didn't care about this case in the slightest, and she was stabbed to death while she slept. Now, that's just the reality of it. She was found covered in a duvet. I don't see any other issue there, since she had nothing in her system. And this one, bless her, Mrs. Pomphret sustained multiple defence-type injuries to both arms and hands. Imagine the pain that must have gone through. Shattered fingers, shattered wrists. I think there's 8 bones in each wrist, if I remember rightly. That's incredible. Consistent with infliction by a crowbar-like implement. What a terrible way to go. Mr. Cole, at times it seems the defendant became confused, would apologise for becoming confused, and then start up again from where he stopped. Throughout he seemed very upset and shocked. There were points where he appeared as though he was going to cry, but no tears would come. David Pomphret repeatedly denied having anything to do with the killing of his wife's interview. He disposed of some of his clothing in the aftermath. Mr. Cole. After his arrest, the defendant was interviewed over a lengthy period of time. Throughout those interviews, he denied any responsibility for killing his wife. He was initially arrested on November the 3rd. After the arrest and interviews, and because he maintained his innocence, and due to the extensive efforts by Mr. Pomphret to cover up his involvement, the police had to conduct a very careful inquiry, piecing together CCTV, phone data, search evidence, and such. It meant the defendant was released after the first arrest. These interviews are a totally lying account of what happened to Marie Pomphret. The stables were searched to determine if there were any other persons injured or otherwise present at the scene, which proved negative. David Pomphret was then taken to Warrington Police Station. Paramedics arrived on the scene at 10:12 p.m. and the landlord of the Fiddle of the Firth? I'm not sure what that says, but Fiddle of the Lyeth pub joined the defendant, by this time on the main road, and asked what was happening. The landlord then directed the ambulance while the defendant followed the paramedic to the scene. The paramedic knew by looking at her that she was obviously deceased. She had her head caved in with a fucking crowbar. Yep, she's deceased. The defendant was put in the rear of the ambulance. David Pomphret asked the call handler why it was taking so long for the emergency services to respond. He said, "Who would have done this? Who has done this to my wife?" We now know that it was he who had done this to his wife. The call handler attempted to guide Pomphret through CPR, but he refused, saying, "She is white as a sheet, her chest isn't moving." No, she is stone cold. The call handler continued to encourage him to start CPR, to which he responded, "Are you joking?" I know several, I work with 4 first aiders, and I know several first aiders that wouldn't tell you how to perform CPR. I know how. I'm really big on sticking to keeping up to date with my first aid, and I wanna progress with that as well. I want to become trained to train. But if somebody goes down, you don't know first aid, and you've got somebody on the phone saying, "This is how you perform CPR, this is how you do the repetitions, this is how you do the breaths," and you turn around saying, "Hell no, and that's my wife," there's a problem there straight away. Regardless of how she's looking, you're going to try and save your wife, So I'm going to repeat that. The call handler attempted to guide Pomphret through CPR, but he refused, saying she's as white as a sheet, her chest isn't moving. No, she is stone cold. The call handler continued to encourage him, which he responded, "Are you joking? This isn't a million miles away. This is Knutsford. I've lived there. It's like 20 minutes from Macclesfield. This is just up north." This is not something that just happens on EastEnders and Coronation Street. This is real life. This guy smashed her face in with a crowbar. The defendant was asked what time he had seen his wife, and he gave